News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here on a Thursday. Good show on tap. I invite you to join in the conversation. We're going to talk about some of the more high-profile legal cases, criminal court cases that we have here in the region. Specifically starting off this morning, and we're going to touch on several, the Gabby Doolin case, which many of you paid close attention to yesterday for her sentencing hearing, this coming just about 4 years after she was murdered. And finally, Timothy Madden sentenced. Various elements to this to talk about. A lot of you still have questions about, the nature of sentencing, courtroom decorum, and how things play out there, as well as how you decide whether to seek death or life in a case like this, which is about as bad as it gets. To talk about it, to take your calls and questions on all of the cases we'll talk about this morning, it's always good to have my partner in crime. That would be Nick Squared, News Channel 5 legal analyst Nick Leonardo.
Hey, good morning.
Hello, sir. The Gabby Doolin case was one case we seriously considered covering gavel to gavel if it happened. And you'll recall just a couple of days before it was set to go to trial earlier this year, Timothy Madden pleads guilty, accepts life in prison without possibility of parole in connection with the murder of Gabby Doolin, a little 7-year-old girl. And so I was kind of asking Nick, and people asked me, if he's already done all that, Nick, why did they have to have a sentencing hearing yesterday?
Well, I think maybe there was another count that he pled guilty to.
That's right, kidnapping. And
so in that context, the court would have to have a separate sentencing hearing to determine the manner of service or how many years that person's going to get. And then the court also has to consider, certain factors, mitigating factors or enhancing factors to determine the appropriate sentence. And I think maybe it was a kidnapping count that he also had pled guilty to. So it's part of what must occur in certain circumstances when you have multiple counts and you don't have an agreed upon sentence on everything.
Okay, and then I think we were trying to remember the name, but I think it's an Alford plea.
An Alford plea.
A lot of people say, well, you know what, he also, and there was some graphic testimony, he also raped and sodomized her before basically strangling her to death and then leaving her face down in this water. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why were those charges? And the Alford plea, the way I understood it, was something where they're acknowledging if those charges went to trial, he would be convicted. But it's not going to trial, so it's kind of an Alford plea where that technically won't be a conviction for him on those counts. Why do they do that?
More or less kind of a best interest plea.
Why would the prosecution agree to that when they've got him dead to rights anyway? Is this some reason that they had to negotiate to get the plea?
Well, so, a lot of times we have the Tennessee Victims' Rights Amendment, and so they have to apprise the victim of every step of the way of the prosecution, what's going to occur. And a lot of times the victims' families, they weigh in on that and they will accept some sort of plea like that because, I believe the death penalty was a consideration in this case.
Yes.
And if you see how long it takes someone to be executed in the state of Tennessee, and they continue to sit on death row, and as the execution nears 30 years from now, that person's on TV again, and so there's not so much closure for the family a lot of times, and so this does bring closure, and we won't hear from Mr. Madden ever again. That's it.
He can't appeal it. He's done.
Right. That's right.
Well, listen. The hearing yesterday was very emotional and brings up some other points during sentencing about some of the things that happened. Chris Conti was our reporter in the newsroom, filed a report on that. Just in case you haven't seen it yet, including some of the tension that really escalated at one point when Amy Doolin, Gabby's mother, was giving her victim impact statement. And I just want you to comment after we see this, just on decorum and how things are handled in the courtroom, security, because all that comes into play when it's this emotional. Let's have a look at Chris's story.
This child deserves better than this.
For 1,439 days, Gabby Doolin's family had waited for this day, the day they would finally be able to speak with the man who shattered their world.
How could anyone do this? How could someone be so evil and so sick to do these things that had been done to our baby girl?
It was November 15th of 2015 when Amy Doolin lost her little girl. Gabby had been at her brother's football game when she disappeared into the woods. For the first time today, we learned that Timothy Madden raped her, then dragged her body to a small pond where he strangled and drowned Gabby Doolin. She was 7 years old.
And then they came to me and said, "I'm sorry, but she is gone." The hardest words I've ever heard in my life, the most gut-wrenching moment of my life. I wailed and I screamed, "No, I want my baby. God, please, no, I want my baby."
There was no question as to Madden's guilt today. Instead, this was simply to determine how long he should spend in jail for what he did. As Gabby's mom spoke, her father, Brian, noticed Madden's attention turn away. Unable to hold in the pain of the last few years, he gave in.
You can let him listen to what she's got to say. Do you understand me? Do you understand me?
Mr. Doolin, Mr. Doolin.
I'm sick of it. We've had 4 years. He can give her 3 minutes to say what she needs to say.
Let's take a brief recess, if you'll escort Mr. Madden out.
30 minutes.
The judge quickly tried to regain control.
Off the record, ladies and gentlemen, stop this. All of you, now.
After a break, Gabby's mom composed herself again and had one last thing to say to the man who murdered her daughter.
Because of you, we lost our baby girl. Our boys lost their sister before she was even 8 years old. You took her from us. Why did you do it? There is no reason that you could give.
And with that, Timothy Madden was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
And not one time have I observed 1 ounce of remorse.
A life that will now be spent behind bars for a life that he so senselessly took away. Chris Conti, News Channel 5.
Okay, a lot to talk about coming out of that. And again, Nick, in all the years, I've been covering all kinds of trials. This was one of the very worst, if not the worst. To me, short of mass murder, there is not a crime worse out there than the rape and murder of a child, period. There's nothing worse than that, aside from mass murder. And my heart goes out to the Doolin family. And I'll tell you this, I want you to speak to the situation in the courtroom there. I understand exactly where Brian Doolin was coming from. We don't know whether or not he was talking to his attorney or if Madden was just trying to tune her out. But I understand. Remember, they had sat through, by the way, all morning long hearing testimony from the police about what happened to their daughter.
That's right.
And then Doolin is trying, Amy's giving her statement, and he's showing no remorse, not paying attention. I understand why Brian Doolin was so angry. So how about the way that played out? You see that happen sometimes.
Well, and they're given victim impact statements at the sentencing hearing. They're allowed to do that, and I mean, obviously, I think everybody would be a little upset, and if you're sitting there trying to, this is your one chance to address this person who has done these things, and they appear to have no remorse or not listening, I think we all would be a little upset. And the judge is in a really tough spot because the last thing you want to do is handcuff or arrest, some victim's family member because they were that upset. So it was a tricky position, but the judge got control of the matter, rather quickly. But my heart goes out to them. I think we all would be upset if we were in their shoes like that.
They anticipate these things. You saw immediately, and there's security in the courtroom. Keep in mind, too, Madden's family was in the courtroom. Of course, the Doolin family was, and the Madden family, I mean, I'm sure is hurt with what they've seen and heard. But yeah, they cleared the courtroom. That would have been the last thing she would have wanted to do, was to have charged Brian Doolin with contempt.
Well, not only contempt. I mean, what if he were to,
if he
slap
got to
a security guard or something, like that?
Or had gotten to Madden.
Right. That's exactly right, and that's why you have courtroom security. And I'd say 99% of the time, everything goes off the way that it's supposed to. But it's that 1% of the time that courtroom staff must be vigilant about and must always be paying attention, because it can really turn very quickly. When tempers get flared, and we see it in every courtroom all over Tennessee.
You get this sense if the judge could have given Madden more somehow, some way, and he's getting the most he can short of the death penalty, she would have, you heard her say at the end there, not once did he ever show any remorse. And even in the aftermath, his attorney issued a statement where he continues to claim that he's innocent. Now, of course, there's something obviously very wrong with this man, but I mean, they found Gabby Doolin's blood on his underwear. Okay, he pleaded guilty to this as well, all right? I mean, there's DNA linking him to this completely.
And he was a complete stranger, so he was not a family friend, or he did
I think there was some familiarity there. I don't know if he had some younger relatives that maybe played with. But you're right. It's not like this was someone close to the Doolin family at all. But they were at that football game that night. Just the biggest mystery of this, and you've had some high-profile cases that just sometimes, and you've observed them. What on earth? The guy didn't have priors to this level, anything like this. And by all accounts, he was at the game playing little hide and seek, doing some breaks with the kids, running around, just having fun with them. And then he just grabs her. No one sees it really, and takes off and does this within less than 30 minutes. That's the thing that scares and disturbs me the most, that he could become a monster just right there. Why? How?
Well, I mean, obviously someone that does or engages in any kind of activity like that has serious mental health issues. And, maybe he's done other things. He just has not been caught.
Yeah, people have brought that up to me.
But I don't think anyone's going to plead guilty. It's not my experience in the practice of law that people plead guilty to life in prison when they are in fact innocent. I mean, what do you have to lose? It doesn't get a whole lot worse than that. And the other thing, too, is that if you were on death row, that's a really horrible place to be compared to being in a general population. So sometimes you will see people plead guilty, who are in fact guilty of murder, to the first-degree murder, to get the death penalty off of the table, because it's a much better place or environment.
Well, and they don't ultimately want to be executed, though. Isn't that what it is? A lot of times they say, look, we have the death penalty, and if you plead, we'll give you life in prison. Otherwise, we're going to convict you and we're going to kill you. Now, we all know you spend years on death row.
The odds are that Mr. Madden, given his age, would have died on death row before he was executed.
Yeah. And so that's your answer for you folks. Many of you are messaging me asking why did they not seek it. The family was very involved in this decision, and Amy Doolin basically told me this was the best thing to do because they could not bear the thought of going through all of these hearings and appeals and having to relive what happened to their daughter if he had been given the death penalty.
Well, and look at every time someone's executed here at Riverbend.
Right.
I mean, leading up to the execution, we see all the petitions for stays and clemency, and all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and you continue to see the defendant on TV. And so, I mean, there really is not a whole lot of closure. So at least this way, he's probably not going to pop up on TV after the next couple of weeks. That'll be it.
And there was no trial, but there is absolutely no question in my mind, or I imagine anyone else's, this man did it. And life for a convicted child rapist and murderer behind bars? Not necessarily. Behind bars is tough, period. But where does he rank in the hierarchy of crimes among other inmates?
Well, I mean, I think his points would be when you plead guilty, you're found guilty, you go to Tennessee Department of Corrections.
Well, this will be in Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, but they would still have to classify him based on points, and I don't think that there's anyone that's going to be any higher other than a mass murderer, as you would say.
But I just mean how other inmates view convicts who commit these types of crimes. You hear about that, whether or not that's urban legend or not, that other inmates, they're going to look down. I may have killed someone, but I killed a man. You raped and murdered a child. We're coming for you.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a horrible, horrible, horrible crime. I can't think of anything any more egregious than what this man has done.
Well, hopefully to some degree it brings an end to this for the Doolin family. Of course, they'll always miss their beloved daughter. We'll take a break. When we come back, we have some phone calls on that, as well as taking some more questions from me, Nick Will, on other cases, including the Delkey case. I have a couple questions for you on that. We'll be right back with your calls and more with Nick Leonardo right after this.